Good afternoon, Ed.
Good afternoon, Mark.
Today is October 24th. I think I might have said October 4th this morning. So contrary to what I said previously, it's actually October 24th, 2008. But we're here for part two of our interview with Ed Runge, who is an agronomist. And we had a fascinating discussion this morning. I warned you that I'm going to throw a curveball at you. We've been doing this in somewhat chronologic order, but I'm going to take a little bit of a step back in time. I want you to talk a little bit about how the soils here in Illinois, especially central Illinois, got to be the way they are.
Well, the central Illinois soils generally are what we call dark-colored soils. They're either thick loess soils, much as Sangamon, Morgan County, or they're thin loess over an Illinois or a Wisconsin glacial till. That Wisconsin glacial till moved as far as Shelbyville, Illinois. And there's a big moraine at Shelbyville, and so if you go south of Shelbyville, you have the gray soils, and north you have the dark-colored soils. The loess cap, the silty material on both, is roughly the same depth, say about 4 feet. And the soils to the south were on a very weathered pre-Wisconsin surface that was depleted of nutrients, had been highly weathered. And the soils to the north were on calcareous, brand new 20% calcium carbonate till or loess. And so the soils then weathered much more rapidly where they were on an acid substrate than they did where they were on an alkaline substrate, the Wisconsin glaciation. And so through their fertility from the silty material put on top was depleted much more rapidly in those that had an acid substrate versus those that had a basic substrate. And so roughly that is the big chronological change. Now, time-wise, that is, 20,000 plus or minus years ago.
Can you explain a little bit more detail exactly what the action of the glacier had, the impact that had?
Well, the glacier essentially moved like a giant bulldozer. The Great Lakes are assumed to have been gouged out by the glacier in many cases. And while they went across Illinois, for the most part, they were depositing material that was in the ice as the ice retreated. And so the glacier, I mentioned, been at the Wedren silica pit, and where you've seen that the glacier overrode a spruce forest in that, and that was a Wisconsin sheet on top of another Wisconsin sheet of glacial material. So this action is like a volcanic action. It's brand new material. It's the bedrock ground up. In this case, it's basic material. It runs 20-25% limestone. And these soils then keep their nutrients much longer because the limestone has to weather before many of the other minerals will weather. And this is a little bit why the soils south of Shelbyville were depleted of their nutrients earlier, because there was sort of a sponge below that would absorb anything that would come down. Well, here it didn't do that as much up here. Now that's kind of a crude explanation of that, but anything else I need to explain? I'm not sure I've done as good a job as I should have.
No, that was great. Let's take a short step forward then, maybe only 20,000 years or so.
Okay.
And get you back up to what we had talked about earlier. And we had you at the University of Illinois up to 1973, but you had 1 year where you weren't in Illinois.
No, we have something you can do is take a sabbatic leave or a study leave. And I had been working on these soils that have 20% calcium carbonate in them, and the loess soils. The loess is a uniformly silty material, runs around 20% calcium carbonate and maybe 15-16% clay, depending on a little bit.
And how much organic material?
In the original loess is very little. It's just the flour that came out of the glacier that was redeposited by the wind. So really very little. But since it was calcareous and since it had new nutrients, the blue stem grasses, which we call them the big blue stems, the little blue stems, these grasses grew very well, and they grew and they then caused the dark organic matter to be put on top. And where in south of Shelbyville, those soils were less fertile, And so the grassland was also there, but it grew much less vigorously. And so the soils weathered because there was more water percolating through those soils and less evapotranspiration because the plants weren't growing nearly as vigorously.
What was that word again?
Evapotranspiration. It's the use of water either from evaporating from a surface or going through a plant and evaporating from a leaf.
Okay.
So I spent my study year in New Zealand, and I wanted to study silty soils that had no calcium carbonate in them. And the only place I could find them in the world, I couldn't go to China because that didn't work, and they had similar soils to what we have. So I went to New Zealand because the silty soil there is made from a neutral bedrock material, grey-wacky generally they call it. And so the silty loess that came from their glaciers was free of calcium carbonate. So in my scheme of things, the phosphate weathering took place immediately upon deposition, where in Illinois the phosphate weathering really didn't advance very much till you got rid of the calcium carbonate. And so that was sort of the reason I went to New Zealand. And it was a great year. Great country.
Any observations about the people and the culture you met in New Zealand?
Well, New Zealand is settled by English, Scottish, some Irish, and there are a few others, but mostly English and Scottish people. And I lived in Christchurch, which is on the South Island, and people said you'll find it more English than England. And that's partially true. They're delightful people. So to me, it's the England without having, 4,000 years of history behind it. It's brand new country for them, like the U.S. So if you go to Australia and New Zealand, it's sort of the western country of the U.S. with an English background.
Mm-hmm. I assume you took the family with you as well.
Oh, yes, yeah, they went to school. So everything worked well.
And from an agronomist point of view, what was the most rewarding part about being there that year? What was the thing that you learned?
Well, I guess the thing that I learned is that, first of all, the research project that I wanted to work on worked very well. Secondly, the kids were exposed to an entirely different culture, and they found out that people do things in that country like they do things here. And so that type of thing probably took place. But I guess if you really go back to it, in a professional business that I'm in, is I gained a whole new circle of professional people that I can interact with. And probably that's the most rewarding over a career.
Okay. What happened to your career after 1973?
Well, I took a bit of a turn and went to the University of Missouri to be chairman of the agronomy department. And I kept my research going that I was doing in Illinois until about 1978. And at that point, I had more money. I had enough money to hire someone else. And I'd had a postdoc who turned out less successful than the previous postdoc, at least in my terminology. And I was ready to, and the people were expecting me to be more involved in administrative issues than just research issues. So 1978, I really dropped my research that I'd been doing, hired another professor to do it, and then I left Missouri 2 years later in 1980.
But you mentioned that you continued your research, but you were doing it now in Missouri instead of Illinois.
Right, but I was carrying the research program that I had done in Illinois and applying it across the Midwest while I was in Missouri.
Okay, here's another challenging question perhaps for somebody who's been in academia. Did you find being the chair of the department rewarding or distracting?
That's a pretty easy answer. I think that most successful administrators find out that the game has changed. It's no longer you in the front. It's who you can put together and how can you get a team to work more effectively. So you have to enjoy seeing the people you hire and work with succeed, and you need to lubricate the mechanism so they can be more successful. And so you really chalk your success up in a little different way. But I feel like my role as an administrator was because I'd done extension, because I'd done teaching, because I'd done research. I knew the game. I knew how people were evaluated. And I think that, you know, it's a little bit, you can praise in public, but you criticize in private. And it works. You know, you can get your rewards out of administering something and seeing other people grow, equally rewarding as seeing things you do yourself.
Did you find that to be a important skill to kind of add to your quiver? So
yeah, I guess when you first take a job like that, you kind of wonder whether you're prepared for it or whether or not you can do it. And I had role models. I had Bill Peer at Iowa State, I had Marlo Thorne at Illinois, M.B. Russell at Illinois, people that are respected, and I observed how they did their business. And the thing is that you can steer the ship, and you don't necessarily, you know, do all the things on the ship. But if you praise your faculty, first of all, you have to have good faculty. But if you have good faculty, it's pretty easy to, I think, create what I call an environment where the whole ship is lifted. In other words, and not everyone is successful at doing that. But I think you have to have an alter ego. I think you have to be able to say, hey, my success is your success, because as a department head, you no longer get success for what you do. You only get success for your unit if it's successful. And so I think you have to look at it somewhat differently.
Well, professors don't necessarily have the reputation for being the most team-spirited and cooperative group of people.
Well, we're as variable as any other group of people in society. And some professors are much more fun for me to be around than others. Some have an ego which, you know, you can't accommodate, and some have such an alter ego you have to build them up. And so basically, as I look at it, you have to, what I say I learned in Indonesia in spades, you have to be able to put on the other person's shoes, and what would you expect your boss to do if you were in the other person's shoes. And I think if you can wear the other person's shoes and relate to it, and also you have to be enough interested that you can ask the right questions, you can set the right expectations, and these kinds of things. And if you do that, you can be equally successful as an administrator.
I think you might have just alluded to it. Did you have a sabbatical during those years?
No, the only sabbatical I had was at Illinois in 1970-71. And then when I stepped down as being department head at Texas A&M, I went back to Illinois for the year 2000 on a study leave. So I've had 2 study leaves.
Did you have the opportunity to go overseas while you were in Missouri?
Oh, I've had a lot of opportunities to go overseas. I first made my first trip overseas in 1968. And then I followed that trip when I took my family in 1970. And I'm not sure that I'd have had the confidence to take a wife and 2 little kids that far away without having made that 1968 trip. But anyway, I've had the good fortune now. I think I've probably worked in some 60, 70 different countries in my career.
Did you go to Indonesia while you were at the university in Missouri?
I went to Indonesia once when I was at the University of Illinois in 1972. And then they asked me to go back, and I went back in 1976. In 1976, I took my wife and kids with me, and they were, they were 13, 12, I forget what their ages were, but anyway, one was born in 59, so one was 16, I guess, and the other one was, they were in high school, junior high school. And we took them, you know, we took their books with them, but their education really was learning batik, learning about Indonesia. We had another family that we shared, had kids like our age, and so they learned from each other. But as far as them poring over their books and doing study assignments, I'm not sure we were very successful with that, but their education came from a different perspective.
Well, that's an incredible opportunity, because as much as New Zealand is different from the center of the United States, I would think Indonesia is different in a much, much bigger way.
Yeah, New Zealand is kind of like here. Indonesia is not like here. And there's Java, where we were on the island of Java, is among the most densely populated pieces of real estate in the world, Bangladesh and maybe the Netherlands being more or less the same. But anyway, you had to learn to do many different things. And their culture is entirely different. You know, the Buddhists were there, the Hindus were there, the Muslims are there, and Christianity was a very small segment of the total population. Now, the Hindus were pushed mostly to Bali, and so Bali is an island of a very high Hindu population. But Java was mostly Muslim, and some Buddhists left, and some Hindus left, and some Christians there, but a different kind of mix. And the Muslim religion was interpreted, in my perspective, quite differently from the Middle East. So much more pragmatic, I think would be the way to say it.
More inclusive as well?
More inclusive, and I felt less restrictive on women in particular.
Okay. What was the nature of your work?
Well, both of in Indonesia, we were trying to help them with their soil development on other islands, Borneo, Kalimantan in the Big Island, and also on Sumatra. And they were trying to, since the population was so dense on Java, they were trying to translocate entire groups of people to underpopulated islands, which they had a large number of. And we were looking at the soil resources on some of those areas where they were hoping to move people to.
I'm going to take a guess at this. I'm assuming that these places you were moving to were basically rainforests.
Not always, but generally they were not dry. Generally there is a wet season and a dry season, but when you're very close to the equator, you can have 2 wet seasons and 2 dry seasons. Java's wet season, it was far enough south that they had a wet season that essentially was our winter, and their dry season would be our summer. And western Java was much wetter than eastern Java, for example.
What were the challenges from the soil scientist's point of view?
Well, again, those soils in many cases have been there a long time. Now, a lot of Java and Bali are volcanic, so those soils are fairly recent, and they're quite fertile, very high in potash, for example, compared to the more weathered soils. So you go to Borneo and Sumatra, those are very old landscapes, no volcanic activity of any real major significance, particularly Borneo. And so the soils there were much more, you got to bring the fertility to the soil and things like this.
Were you wearing your researcher's hat or your extension officer hat?
I kind of couldn't tell which one I was wearing, both of them I would say. But we were looking to apply technology more so than to discover technology.
Did you work quite a bit then with the local population?
Mostly with other people that were involved in the transmigration schemes. And this would be university professors and then local politicians more so than individual farmers. But we did visit with individual farmers.
Were they generally receptive to what you were telling them?
I think so, yeah. It's, again, you don't necessarily know all the answers. You can ask the questions more sometimes better than you can give them the answers. So
an exchange of information in both directions.
That's right.
This takes you up, I believe, to 1980, and then where did you move from there?
Well, in 1980, I had the opportunity to go to Texas A&M, where I still am, and was able to, they hired me to be head of the Soil and Crop Sciences Department. We would call that agronomy in Illinois. And as I told you earlier, our job as agronomists is to make plants grow better. So it was probably one of the largest soil and crop science agronomy departments in the world. And so I went there. They wanted me to come, and I administered that for 19 years before I decided I ought to do something else. So I was an administrator for 26 years, if you count the 7 at Missouri.
This is the opportunity to bring up a subject I know you will enjoy talking about, because you've had a long relationship with Norman Borlaug and a little bit with Henry Bicho as well. So Tell us a little bit about Norman Borlaug, and let's start with how you met him in the first place.
Well, I first met Norman got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for the Green Revolution in wheat. If you would look back in the 60s, we were shipping as much wheat as we could to India and Pakistan. You know, India and Pakistan used to be always in part of India, but then it split mostly on religious lines. So they had East Pakistan and West Pakistan, which then East Pakistan became Bangladesh. So Dr. Borlaug was commissioned and hired by the Rockefeller Foundation to keep Mexico supplied with food rather than importing food.
This would have been at what time frame?
He went to Mexico in 1944 after he was released from the War Manpower Commission, where he'd worked with DuPont in World War II. And so he spent the next 62 years mostly in Mexico and developed these short-statured, high disease-resistant, widely adapted, day-length independent wheat varieties. These were spring wheats, we would call them, so you can't grow them here in Illinois because winter kill would set in. So they're planted in the spring, and he actually do two crops, one in the mountains in the summertime and one in the fall in Sonora in northern Mexico, and developed these wheats and found through interns that worked with him that these wheats were adapted to many other parts of the world. Paul Ehrlich, who is probably known by many of the people that might listen to this, predicted that, you know, famine, there was no way to prevent famine from, you know, decimating India. Well, Dr. Borlaug's wheats went into India in about the mid-60s, plus or minus a year or two, and by I might have these dates a little wrong, but I think in Pakistan was self-sufficient in wheat before 1970 and India after 1970. So what really happened is that the wheat production in India has gone up fourfold since Borlaug's wheats were introduced. They had to be fueled with fertilizer, so he was insistent that they'd have the fertilizer to power these wheat genetics. And he also was insistent that they had to essentially establish floor prices, uniform prices, because farmers had to take risks. They had to borrow money to buy fertilizer, and they had to then be able to sell their wheat at some kind of an incentive price. And so India became self-sufficient in wheat in the early 70s, and it produces, say, at least 4 times as much wheat now as it did before 1960 on 10% more land. So essentially the total production has gone up at least threefold in that period of time. So India to this day, now Hank Bicho was involved in the rice story, and that's the other principal carbohydrate crop that India would use, and the Philippines and Indonesia and all these rice consuming nations, particularly the tropical ones, and China as well. And so that rice story and the wheat story essentially rewrote history.
Was Henry Bicho, was he working in the same place that Borlaug was?
No, Henry Bicho was first at Beaumont, Texas, at our Texas A&M Rice Center, working for a U.S. Department of Agriculture. He went to Erie, the International Rice Research Institute, in 1963.
Which is where?
That's in Los Baños, the Philippines, near Manila, in the Philippines. And he went there in 63. They released IR8, International Rice number 8, in about 66. And I first met Hank Bicho in 1968 when I came back through the Philippines on my first trip abroad. And then since 1980, then he went to Indonesia, and I met him again in Indonesia when I was there in Bogor in 72. I don't think I saw him in 74 or 76. And then he came back to Texas in 80. His wife was ill, and she passed away in, I think, 81. And it was his first wife. And then he was involved in rice work in Texas. He was very much interested in hybrid rice, and he worked for a place called Rice Tech. Hank Bicho turned 100 in September of 2007, I believe, and he passed away in December 2007. So he lived to be 100, and Norman Borlaug is presently 94. He'll be 95 in March.
The way you've described both Borlaug's work and Bicho's work, this is essentially hybridization of a particular crop.
Well, actually they make the hybrid by crossing two parents, and then this becomes a variety because they don't change those genetics anymore, and it's then a fixed variety. And so we would not call that a hybrid. A hybrid is a new combination every year. So when we produce hybrid corn, we have to buy new seed each year because the hybrid vigor goes away. So they make a cross, which would be a hybridization, between two lines. It produces what we call an F1 hybrid. And then they keep growing it. So they maybe grow it 6, 7 generations, and they say, hey, this is a better variety now because they haven't changed the genetics after the first crop. Now they might introduce other things along the way, but basically it's just a plain crossbreeding experiment.
Takes some time though to do that.
It takes lots of time, and the more crosses you make, the more children you have to look at. And so what Dr. Borlaug was able to do was to grow 2 crops in 1 year of wheat, a winter crop in Sonora, northern Mexico, and a summer crop in the high altitudes near Mexico City. And so he's able to get 2 generations per year. So that speeded it up, doubled the speed in which he could do it. And he had Mexico self-sufficient in wheat production. He went there in '44. In about 1956, it was self-sufficient in wheat production. And then Mexico became the big exporter of these varieties that Dr. Borlaug developed to India and Pakistan. So they moved shiploads of wheat to India and Pakistan for them to plant these new varieties. And so within a matter of 3 years, essentially everybody was growing the new material.
Well, and some of this is my curiosity about the creative process. You talked earlier about hybridization of corn and how that was something that was going on late 30s into the 1940s.
It started in the 20s, but it was really going on in the 30s.
And you didn't mention any names when we talked about that hybridization process, but now you've got Norman Borlaug, who wins the Nobel Peace Prize, who, but I got to believe that it wasn't just Norman Borlaug. There was very much a collaborative project.
Well,
as well.
there was many other people involved in his team, but he certainly set the pace and set the expectation. And Bicho did the same thing with rice.
Was Borlaug something of a promoter of his ideas as well?
Borlaug was a salesman as well as a very good scientist. He's in the National Academy of Sciences. He's a member of that. He's gotten 52 or 53 honorary doctorates, that I believe is right.
Wow.
He's won the Congressional Gold Medal, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, you name it, he's won it.
Well, I read also he's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame.
He's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. He was a wrestler at Cresco High School, and he was a wrestler at the University of Minnesota. And so I've been fortunate. I brought Dr. Borlaug to Texas A&M along with Perry Atkinson and a president that we had who wanted to have a Nobel laureate on campus. So Perry Atkinson was chancellor of the university, and I knew Perry. He's an entomologist. And he suggested that, hey, let's go after Borlaug. Vandiver, our president, wanted to have a Nobel laureate, and he said he had the money to hire one. So I approached Dr. Borlaug at a meeting I was at Iowa State. He had been there. And then Dr. Atkinson went to a talk that he was giving at Texas Tech in Lubbock. And through that, we got him to come to Texas A&M. So he came for 1 semester. He still comes, 1 semester a year. And so my wife and I have been fortunate that we're almost part of the Borlaug family at this point.
Well, I was going to ask, what's the nature of the relationship the two of you have?
Well, I was his boss, he'd say, for 19 years. And I would say that he was my friend very quickly on. We've had many similar experiences. He's 19 years older than I am. And so basically, you know, he lived a generation before I did. So he experienced the Depression for real in the University of Minnesota when he was a student there. He was there in the 30s. And so, you know, that was, you know, people standing in lines and no jobs, and, you know, people were trying to unionize and try to enforce union. And he said, you know, he never saw such a mess, you know. He lived in rural Iowa, and, you know, they had the garden like we did, you know. They basically were almost self-sufficient. So he goes to the big city of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and he says, my gosh, things are bad.
During the time he was at Texas A&M, was he teaching or doing research?
He did mostly teaching, yeah. He was, see, he didn't come to A&M. See, he would have been 70 years old the first year he was there.
Oh.
And so 24 years later, we still have him as one of our professors. He got an honorary doctorate from Texas A&M last December. That's the last one he's gotten. But I think Senator McGovern's, I forget which school it is, it's Wesleyan University in South Dakota, is giving him an honorary doctorate, I think, in the next couple of weeks. But he won't be able to go. He's too frail at this point.
It's sad, I think, that not more people know about the story of people like Norman Borlaug.
It really is.
Or Bicho.
There is a book being written. There's one written now by a guy named Leon Hesser about Borlaug, and I got another one in the car that just came out this past 2 weeks ago. It's Borlaug by a guy named Noel Vietmeyer, and there were going to be 4 in that series. So this first book goes from Borlaug's birth until 1944. The next book goes from Borlaug's going to Mexico to the Nobel Peace Prize. And so there's going to be 4 in this series. So Noel Vietmeyer is a tremendous writer, so I'd recommend that people see if they can't find the books, and if they need help, I'll try and help them find them.
Would you agree with those who say that because of the work of people like Borlaug and Bicho, that 1 billion or more people are alive today?
Well, the Atlantic Monthly about 15 years ago wrote an article on Borlaug and said they credit him with saving more lives than any man that ever lived. And they estimated that people that were this whole Green Revolution thing, he probably saved somewhere around 1 billion lives in India, Pakistan, China through those wheats that were released and the rices that were released. So now I think, in fairness to many other people, Borlaug and Bicho get a lot of credit, but there were many, many soldiers in this effort. You know,
well, you would be one of those.
Well, yeah, but I'm a little bit younger than some of the other soldiers. But we had, you know, Henry Wallace, hybrid corn. You know, he didn't get credit, but you know, you look at what has happened to corn, and there's an army of people that have been involved. And on rice and wheat, there are many more people than just Borlaug and Bicho that made this thing go. But I think that individually, they did have sort of what I call the leading edge role, particularly with wheat and rice. And it's sort of, if you go back, and if you could compress Henry Wallace's hybridization ideas of the late 20s and squeeze that late 20s to 1940, 44, that compression of time that these things took place on wheat and rice was so short. I mean, it was 5 years. And it was, you know, you go from starving people to feeding people, surplus.
And to put that all into context, this is the years, those crucial years after the Second World War. India was hardly a stable society. They were, as you mentioned already, they were torn apart by civil war, and with all of the displacement and the agricultural disruption that goes along with that. So I can see now, as you describe it, how they're that close to mass starvation.
Well, the ship that was hauling the wheat from India was supposed to offload in Pakistan and offload in India. The 7-Day War took place before the ship got to either place in, you know, the India-Pakistani War. So there's lots of what I call the Watts riot in Los Angeles was involved because the trucks from Mexico couldn't get to the port. So read the books. It's all there. So.
Well, it makes a fascinating adventure story.
It's an adventure. It really is. And I guess if you look at people like Borlaug, and maybe Bicho too, it's almost like a priest taking a vow. You know, their vow was to help people get enough to eat. And that's all they did their whole life. So it's really kind of an interesting story. So, you know, this newer, younger, I mean, history's got to help us know what really went on. And I think the Wiedemeyer books are going to be a bit more comprehensive than Leon Hesser's book, because there are going to be much more stories that I'm telling you about here involved in those. So it's just read the books. It's a fascinating story. Google Borlaug, you know, we can say you can Google it, but you'll get lots of information. You'll get his Nobel laureate speech. You'll get lots of things.
Can you, off the top of your head, do you recall the names of any of these books, the titles?
Well, the first one is Norman Borlaug, The Man Who Saved a Billion Lives, I believe. That's by Leon Hesser. And then this other one is Borlaug, The Maverick of the Green Revolution, I believe, by Noel Wiedemeyer.
Well, we're in the season of mavericks right now.
Yeah, we are. But this one is a real maverick.
Let's go back to your own career again, and I'm fascinated in all the different places that you've been. And I'm sure a lot of these is during your tenure, your long tenure at Texas A&M. So we talked about Indonesia already. We talked about New Zealand. You've mentioned Brazil a little bit, but I'd like to have you go into more detail about that.
Well, I've taken study abroad classes to Brazil 3 different times, and we generally go for about 3 weeks. And we try to do it between the Christmas, New Year's break, between semesters. So it's a little compressed, but that's summer in South instead of winter here. And so I've been fortunate to have people, again, connections made through various ways. But Fernando Cardoso, the person who was formed MANA fertilizer, M-A-N-A-H, MANA, or Mana, they say in Brazil, he formed the fertilizers that were needed to power the Green Revolution crops in Brazil. And I mentioned these soils were very highly weathered, so they needed micronutrients, they needed magnesium, they needed a whole bunch of things that we don't necessarily have to apply to our soils here, zinc, for example. And so he blended all these things together and was involved in this. So he was always a speaker, the end speaker. He usually met us in Piracicaba, and then he met us at the end of the trip in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And he was sort of what I call, what did you kids learn? Where is Brazil in this whole scheme of things? And I would say that Brazil has the land available to increase production very dramatically. The big problem they have is the infrastructure is so incomplete that it's hard to move bulky commodities long distances with the present infrastructure.
I think we should mention my misconception, and I would imagine a lot of people's misconception, that the lands you're now talking about are all rainforest, and that we'd be slashing and burning and cutting down the rainforest in the process of getting these into productive stage.
Actually, the area is north or south of the rainforest. The rainforest is, this land is called the Cerrado, S-C-E-R-R-A-D-O, and this land was used almost entirely for what I call Wild West grazing. People would turn their cows out, and every year they'd round them up and see if there was a few fat enough to take to market. And so the production was very low, and the palatability of the grasses was very low. So it took at least 4 years for a steer or a heifer or to get to marketable size, because they just had a poor diet. Now, most of that land is a bit of a savanna. It has scrubby tree growth on it, and then it has some grass, but it's not forested in the rainforest sense. Now, if you go further north to Mato Grosso State and go north of Cuiabá, which is the capital, a couple hundred miles, then you'll find there is more dense forest, but again, it's not rainforest. It's sort of the margins, I guess you'd say, of the rainforest. But for the most part, Brazil really is not expecting to change the rainforest very much. So Mato Grosso do Sul, Goiás, Bahia, Minas Gerais, I'm missing some, Mato Grosso do Sul, these are states that are all south of the rainforest, and Brazil has fairly adequate rainfall in most of this area, so it's certainly can increase its production tremendously. Now there's another Brazil, the northeast corner, which is drier, smaller farms, and a poorer aspect of Brazil from a plant growing point of view, but it has its sugar cane under irrigation and things of that nature. But so there's a bit of a, what should I say, south of the rainforest. They put Brasilia in the middle of the Cerrado, the capital, because they wanted to develop this vast territory. And the people who won the World Food Prize 2 years ago were two Brazilians and an American, who essentially established that you could grow good crops on these very, very infertile soils if you took care of the fertility. And the other thing is they're very nice texturally. You'd love them for a garden because they are friable, they're easy to dig, they're low bulk density, have high infiltration rates. So they have some things going for them, but acidity was a big problem.
What then did the farmers have to do to the soils to condition them to the point where they could be productive?
Well, they used to start by saying maybe the first crop we ought to grow is rice. We'll put a dike around the place and we'll maybe add some water to it, because when you reduce the soil under flooded conditions, then you allow the iron phosphates to become available. And so you didn't have to put as much fertility on. But they don't necessarily do that as much as maybe they did 10, 15 years ago. So now it's much more, we know what the fertility package has to be. We know we got to correct the acidity. We know we got to add magnesium. We know we got to add zinc. We know we're going to have to place this fertilizer close to the seed so the plants get it as quick as they can rather than spread it all the way across.
So is it a massive application of lime to start with?
Oh, I wouldn't say massive, but we used to say in southern Illinois you had to put on 4 tons initially and then 4 tons 5 years later. I don't think they'd put on that much because something we call the base exchange capacity is lower for those soils, so you can do it with less. But it does take lime, and it takes a what we call dolomitic limestone, which has got magnesium in it as well as calcium.
I've heard it explained also that because this is developed rather late, that these tend to be huge farm businesses.
I would say that if you go to Paraná, Sao Paulo, south, the farms tend to be kind of like we know farms here. They might be a couple hundred acres, and they might be bigger than that. But I was on one farm and in fact, the governor of Mato Grosso, the state of Mato Grosso, owned this farm. Magi was his last name. He's the largest soybean grower in the world. And on this one farm, he had 49 combines. It was about 100,000 acres. So, but I would say that's the extreme. But a lot of those farms will be a couple thousand acres in size.
And you talked about this a little bit before, but I think it's worth dwelling on again, the infrastructure challenges they currently have.
Well, the big problem is that Mato Grosso do Sul, or Cuiabá, is, my guess, 600-700 miles, maybe more than that, from a port. And the highways are kind of like your county roads here. In other words, they're just not adequate. Some will, in Sao Paulo State, you have pretty good roads. Part of Paraná State, you have pretty good roads. But for the most part, in Mato Grosso do Sul, or Rio Grande do Sul, and Santa Catarina. I've only been in I haven't been in Rio Grande do Sul, but generally speaking, there I think the infrastructure is pretty good. But when you get to Mato Grosso do Sul, Mato Grosso, Goiás, Minas Gerais, those states, the roads are just inadequate. Now they did have, as I understand it, a railroad now to Rondonópolis in Mato Grosso State, and that's a recent phenomenon. So there is at least one railroad going up there.
But why has it been so long for Brazil to develop its rail infrastructure?
Well, I'm not sure I can give you the answer to that. Basically, there was no reason to develop it earlier because there was no production, or you harvest a few cows or calves or whatever per year, but you didn't really have any real economic activity going. So there wasn't enough economic activity to support the development of the infrastructure.
Was that land that they had even less productive than the classic rangeland of the American Southwest that led to those cattle drives up to the railroads coming through Kansas?
A different story, but yes, a lot. In this case, it wasn't dry. It was adequate moisture, but the soils were so poor they didn't grow anything that was palatable. Now, it's kind of like, the spring of the year. If the cow can eat the grass just as it comes so they can eat it, it's much more palatable than it's going to be 6 weeks later or 6 months later. So the big problem you have in there is not that the cows starve, is that what they eat is kind of like, a monotonous diet that doesn't have any energy in it. And so they really don't grow very well. And so it's not the Southwest story in the sense that it was controlled by moisture. It was a different control. It was terribly infertile soils. And so really until 25 years ago, that area was written off. See, Brasilia was established as the capital of Brazil, my guess, in the late 50s, early 60s. And that whole city now is developed in the Cerrado. These are very red soils. They're very highly weathered, and they will erode pretty, if you get water channel. But no-till agriculture, we talked a little bit about earlier, is practiced in a lot of that area. And a lot of it's very, very flat, so the water doesn't run off very fast anyway.
Well, let's jump ahead a few years and put your, make some predictions. Once the infrastructure is there, and with the technology and the knowledge we know about today with soil conditioning, what's the potential?
Oh, I think the potential of Brazil is what I say. It's the potential of the U.S. 100 years ago, and that is that I think they can double, quadruple production over what they're doing now by applying known technology to areas that still haven't been developed. Now, this has to be done in some sort of what I call sustainable manner. You can't do it all at one time. So it's a bit more like the U.S. when we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. Some people went all the way across, but most people only went 100 miles, 200 miles till they found some land that they thought would work. And yes, we had transcontinental railroads that came through and things of that nature, but that's a later phenomenon. I think Brazil, with adequate roads and railroads and the economic activity per unit area now that's possible, they have a very big development future.
Well, where should we turn to next in terms of the world map? Africa?
Well, Africa is, I've been to Africa many times, and more in West Africa than East Africa. And Africa is a Brazil that still hasn't got started in many ways, in my opinion. Now, much of Africa is dry, but there's a large part of Africa that's not that dry, that produces less than it should or could. And the big problems with Africa, there are several problems with Africa. One is education has never been as available to the people there as I think it could be or should be. And so you end up with people who are less educated than, you know, you go to the major cities are the demand areas, the education areas, etc. And there are places where health care is more adequate, things like this. But if you get out into the rural infrastructure, is completely lacking when you get, you know, many miles off the road. It's not unusual for people to basically their staple crops are millet or sorghum or maybe corn, and they eat that most of the time. Maybe they get a chicken once in a while. I'd think a rather monotonous diet, but people, I think, should aspire to more than that, and I think it's very possible for them to do much more than that. The small size of many of those African countries, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Ivory Coast, as you go across from Nigeria, and then Sierra Leone, Liberia, you know, and then you have Guinea, Guinea-Bissau. Many cases, if you have a duty between each country, it'd be like a duty between Rhode Island and Connecticut, or Rhode Island and Massachusetts, or New York City. So you have all of these things which people use to increase their income, but which then stymies the economy. And so the ports are landlocked country, just like Illinois is landlocked and things like this. Well, we have a river and we have railroads which keep us from being landlocked. But in many of those cases, they have one main road or maybe two main roads, and it may not be that good, but the economic development just hasn't occurred. Mm-hmm. So, and good governance is always a problem.
Well, I was going to ask, how much does the political turmoil that continent has had for the last...
Well, you know, I just spent past week with a lady from, she grew up in Liberia, and she's raising, I think, 7 grandkids because the mother and father were murdered by the last army group that was there, which was her sister, her daughter and her husband. And so she's raising her grandkids, and now she lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Kids are in the U.S. now. But I mean, we just can't imagine some of these awful things that take place. And Sierra Leone, I have a student from Sierra Leone that I've been trying to get a hold of since 98, 99. The mail doesn't come back. I never hear from him. I don't know whether he's dead or alive. And I've asked people to help me try and find out whether there's any way for me to get a hold of him. And again, you know, Nanjala University, the University of Illinois, spent a lot of time getting up to speed in Sierra Leone, was completely ransacked and burned and the books thrown out and everything else in the last war that they had in Sierra Leone, which is only the last 4 or 5 years ago.
How much time have you spent in Africa?
Oh, I've spent probably up to 2 weeks many times.
So no extended stays?
No, nothing like Indonesia or New Zealand. I've generally worked in an administrative capacity. I either have faculty members there, or we have projects there, and things that I review or had reviewed. And so Africa has been. I worked in Burma, where I have a project, Myanmar now, and I find that the speed with which people adopt practices that are proven to be beneficial were much more rapid in Burma than they were in Africa. And I can't give you all the reasons for that. I think I've mentioned some, such as infrastructure and good governance and ability to, you know, be able to have some credit, and banks don't work, and no electricity, no nothing.
Lack of a good educational system.
Yeah, lack of education. And in Burma, we went with a crop improvement project. It was corn. We provided seed, the fertilizer, the herbicides, a bit of herbicide, not much. And we showed them how to do it, and we showed them how to plant corn in such a way that you shade the ground early. And when you shade the ground, then weeds don't get the energy from the sun, and they don't grow very well. And so you get weed control because it's dark in a dense cornfield. and things like this, and that has effect on weed control. So we found that we used to give them a practice 2 years. We'd give them the package for 2 years. We soon found out that, hey, we can give it to them in 1 year, and then we can move twice as fast to new areas. The last year we've had a bit over 5,000 farmers we work with. They probably average about 2.5 acres apiece in terms of size. But they've been exporting, and they're fortunate they live close to China. So they've been exporting over $1 million worth of corn to China each year. Well, that's about $200 per farm. Well, $200 in that part of the world is a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And
this has been very recent that you've been doing this work in Myanmar?
I started in '96, and we're still going today.
Well, the military junta was already in power in '96, were they not?
Oh, yeah. And they've gotten more paranoid since. They used to allow us to go to the project area, but in about the last time I was in Burma proper was 2000, and our project leader, our president, who was a World War II veteran, the last time he was there was 2001. So now what we do is the project people come to China. We fly to southwest China. Kunming is the capital of Yunnan province. Then we fly to a small place which is about 50 miles from Burma, and they come to they come to China from Burma, and we do our project review and planning and size up what has to be done and not have to be done. Now we're hoping to go again, but the project might be ending. We aren't sure. Because
of the lack of cooperation with the government?
Yeah, we haven't been able to get funding for the last year and a half. So that's part of our problem.
I'd like to have you put your soil scientist hat on again and talk to me about the challenges in Burma, what you encountered there.
The Burmas, see, this is off the Tibetan Plateau, and so downwearing was a very big part of the land development process. So the soils are more fertile than, say, Brazil, which was very flat and weathered for eons of time. So it's a bit more like Java and Bali in that sense. So if you apply the nitrogen and the phosphorus fertilizers in particular, then the plants grow quite well. Mm-hmm. So you don't need to do the limestone, you don't need to do the minor elements and all that stuff. And so with a sort of what we call a cookbook approach to fertility, and we import the seed, which is, we're trying to produce it in country, and I just have a whole bunch of pictures of them producing hybrids. But anyway, we have a ways to go. So the big thing they have to do is control they have to supply the fertility, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. Once they do that, then they need some seed that's got some yield potential. And one of their big problems is weed control. In spite of what we tell them, their weed control is still not up to where I think it should be, but it's much better than it was.
So much of Burma, I thought, was rainforest. I assume you're talking about the coastal plains?
We're way up in the hills. You see, we're in the Kachin state, which is northern Burma, and we're northern Shan state and southern Kachin state. And the Kachins and the Shans go across into China. I mean,
those are ethnic groups.
They're ethnic groups. And so there's a lot of ethnic groups in that aspect of China. So Yunnan province in China has more ethnic groups than any other province in China. And these go across the borders. And so it's not unusual to have relatives in China or Burma or vice versa and things like that. But it's been a real fun project. It really has. And
what's made it so much fun for you?
Well, I guess just seeing the success. The last time I was there, I went as a Baptist preacher because that way I could get a business permit to go to where I wanted to go.
But you said you were a good Lutheran boy.
Well, they happened to be Baptist there, so the guy that helped me get a business visa was the Shaboy June, who was the head of the Baptist convention in that part of the world. And so anyway, I went, and I came back and I said, Dr. Borlaug, I now know why you travel so much. Because every village we went, there would be a pile of corn, probably 15, 20 bushel. The ladies all came in their best outfit, The men came too. They all wanted a picture taken with this tall guy. And I told Borlaug, you almost felt like they think you were deity, you know, in the aspect of some of these things. So I think just seeing other people succeed beyond their expectation is the payout. So, and they're much better off as a result of us being there.
It sounds like they were very receptive to the things that you were telling them
Yeah,
as well.
it's the first time I went over in '97 to help plant the first plots we were putting out. And there was this lady who probably was in her 60s. She wasn't about. We told them how we wanted to plant, so we wanted to plant in rows, you know, so they can get through, but say 20, 30 inches apart.
Rows of corn.
And we wanted to put the seed about 8 inches apart, so it would shade the ground as quickly as it could. And she insisted that she was going to plant every blasted seed. You know, she wouldn't let anybody else plant that seed. Well, we figured that we almost quadrupled yield on that field over what they had done previously. So that's 4 times as much corn. And actually, I think that was conservative. Now, the problem they have is many times is fencing, so the pigs get out and the cows get in it and, you know, things like that. So they have some, you know, production problem just because of that. But I would say conservatively we increase yields 3 times, and on the optimistic side 5 times.
I would think that presents a couple of new problems. So one would be storage, and the other one you talked a lot about in terms of Brazil is transporting it to a market.
Well, they have a couple things going for them. We're along the Burma Road. The Burma Road was a World War II road from Mandalay to Kunming, China. And so they're reasonably close to China, and there's a lot of truck traffic that goes from China to Mandalay on this particular road. Now, the road was very bad when we first went. It's much better now. But, and that's a separate story. But basically, they're fortunate in that they're on a reasonable road that can get produce in and out. And we develop co-ops. The co-op buys the materials and breaks the bulk commodities down into sizes that individual farmers need for 1 or 2 acres.
Bulk commodities being things like fertilizers?
Fertilizer, seed corn, and herbicides in particular. We buy backpack sprayers, so they have a way of using these things. So it's broken down, and the farmers essentially pay for it. We give it to them the first year, and after that they have to pay for it. Then at harvest time, let's say that we've increased yields 3 or 4 times. Well, if they were subsisting before, let's say that they used 1.5 times as much corn as they did the first time before we came. Well, that means they still got 1.5 times corn that they don't need. So it might be 50 bushel, it might be 20 bushel, but you can't bring a truck to an individual farm for 20 bushel or 50 bushel, so they have to get it to a town center. And then the co-op, arranges, hey, we got a truckload here. Usually these things are bagged. And we have a truckload here, so send the truck in, and we can load the truck on, and generally it goes over to China and brings the money back. And so it's what I call both a buying co-op and a selling co-op, because you have to aggregate it to get into what I call marketable quantities. Now, they do a lot of farmer market kind of stuff. They barter back and forth and things of this nature. And we also did vegetable production and wheat production and things like this.
What was the reason they couldn't have done co-ops before? Was there some cultural reason, or just because they never produced enough to get to that level in the first place?
Oh, I think it might be cultural. I think it's political to a large part. They've sort of been manhandled by the military. I think they live in fear of the military to a very large degree. And so I think that's one of the big problems. One of the things that I'd like to talk a little bit about, which I think is making a difference around the world, is a convergence of agriculture and energy. You know, up until 2006, essentially the farm price of corn was determined by its food value and its use as feed and things like that. Since 2006 in particular, the ethanol demand is such that we've raised the demand. So now it's much more that the price of corn is based on its energy value in addition to its food value. So I look at this as the Brazil sugar mill. It either goes to the sugar shed or it goes to the ethanol plant. It's strictly an economic decision. If I can make more money putting it into the sugar shed, it goes to the sugar shed. If I make more money by converting it to ethanol, it goes to the ethanol
When you say
plant.
putting it into the sugar shed, you mean sugar cane?
Well, it starts as sugar cane, and they grind it up, and they leach the sugar out of the cane, and they end up with what they call the residue, the bagasse, which is then burned to power the plant. It makes the high pressure steam, the low pressure steam, things like that. And so that you get the sugar juice. It's kind of like a molasses mill. You get the sugar juice, and you either have to concentrate the sugar through evaporators, things like this, or you take the sugar juice and you put it into the fermentation tank and you make ethanol out of it. And which way the sugar juice goes is a function of economics. Now, I think the Brazilian government requires a certain percentage be made into sugar. So I think each area has a sugar quota they have to meet before they can do an ethanol. The ethanol quota is not restricted. But anyway, I think that now more and more we're going to see the price of foodstuff. If the energy value is more than the foodstuff, the food value is going to rise to the energy value. The energy value is lower, the food value I think is. So I think we're close to having a situation where basically we have a pricing mechanism which is independent of government policy, more or less worldwide. So if the infrastructure doesn't exist to create an ethanol or a biofuel of whatever version we're talking about, and we'll get out of corn-based ethanol here in 10 years, I presume. So we're using much more cellulosic things. But in the process, I think that the world has received a stabilizing influence on its agricultural commodities. And that's a first in my book.
Well, I think I'm wrapping my brain around what you're talking about here. And this is incredibly important in terms of what we're going through right now with the energy crunch. You're suggesting that in the old days in American agriculture, where you always could count on overproduction and that always drove prices down, now you've got this scenario where a lot of that food production is going towards energy. And so now you've got this interesting balance between the cost of oil and other classical kinds of energy and ethanol and biodiesel, and those are going to have to find some equilibrium, but it's probably going to be more money for farmers?
Well, I think that the whole idea of demand enhancing is to essentially give you a price in which you can stay in business, at least. And hopefully
in other words, that old supply and demand equation of increasing demand.
You're trying to increase the demand, and I think the ability to do this is a different game than it used to be, because now we have this sort of total energy need, which is beyond the bioenergy to provide, at least at this point, such a way that we can essentially, what I call in my old publication of 18 years ago, a sink for the excess production at an acceptable price. So the farmers that took this on as their own demand enhancing, and I'd particularly say ADM was certainly involved in this, but you take these little co-op ethanol plants in western Iowa, southwest Minnesota, eastern South Dakota, and Nebraska. They saw this as an opportunity to essentially increase demand and also allow them to produce something that was useful and increase the income of the rural economy in the process. So I think that's a very big one. Another thing that I've been on is, I've lived my whole life virtually with what we call cheap energy. I remember, I don't know whether I ever bought gasoline for less than 19 cents a gallon, but that's the least I can remember.
There's people who are going to watch this and say, 19 cents a gallon.
Yeah, but I wasn't making anything in it either. I was making $150, $200 a month. So, but you know, you could fill your car up for less than $5. And then all of a sudden in the 70s, it took $20, $30, $40 to fill your car. And, you know, in a couple, 6 months ago, it took $60, $70, depending on the size of the tank of your car to fill it up. And so these are sort of, so I guess I posed to one of the boards that I'm on is if cheap energy, inexpensive energy led to centralization and globalization, where does expensive energy lead us to? Does it lead to localization or less globalization? Well, I don't want to go back to having one orange per year in my Christmas sack. And nobody wants to go back to those good old days. But I do think that we can put the world together a little differently and still have most of the things we value in life. And so I think this globalization, localization is a phenomena that's going to have to listen to the economic pluses and minuses, and I think the scenario is going to be a little different than what we've had in the past. So,
would it be fair to say that you were one of the early advocates of ethanol production for fuel?
I wasn't necessarily an advocate of ethanol production, but when we did an economic study in '86, we started in '86, and essentially when we were exporting a bushel of corn in '87, we were adding about $1 in each bushel. That's what we had to subsidize that export for. And we calculated that if we'd have taken that same production and converted it to ethanol, even if we had to buy the ethanol plant as a government entity, we could have done it for 25 cents. So that was my first demand enhancement instead of supply control, and that was the nature of it. And I got to be known a bit as a pro-ethanol person, but I was really looking at this from an alternative rather than necessarily, and ethanol was a place that you could, so to speak, dispose of excess commodities in large quantities, and still, and still be plenty to eat for everybody else. Well, now it's a little bit different story, and there's some disruptions, and we've had food riots here and there, but I think that we're in a phase where it's going to come together a little different in the future than it has in the past. In terms of so that's kind of the game that I've been trying to work on a little bit.
There's a lot of different directions I think we can go here, but I want to stay with this discussion about ethanol for a bit more, because it certainly is part of our national debate, if you will. And there's a lot of discussion about ethanol and how that is not an efficient way to develop fuel, because you have to use a lot of gallons of gasoline to produce just a few more gallons of ethanol. Can you discuss that?
Well, there's the people that have biases. One is, I don't like the ethanol business, and the other say it's the best thing since anything's gone on. I think if you look at these studies that have taken place, the ones who are biased against it tend to use old studies in which the efficiencies in producing the ethanol are different. So now we get, say, 2.8 gallons of ethanol per bushel of corn. Previously it was less than 2.5. So we end up with more ethanol per bushel of corn. Previously they were using different distillation techniques and things like this. And so you end up with more energy being used in drying the material. You put a feedlot at the end of the ethanol plant, you don't have to dry what we call the distiller's dried grains, or the material that's left after the corn's been digested. So I think there is a reasonable consensus that the new efficient ethanol plants are much more positive in terms of the energy balance than many of the older studies would indicate.
Can you put any ratios to that? 1 gallon of fuel, whether it's in the tractor or in fertilizers or other applications, equals how many gallons of ethanol?
Well, I think the efficiencies are running about 30% on the positive side. So in other words, you get about 30% more energy out than you put in. Now, there's some will claim more than that, but I would say I'd balance it between the 40s that I've seen and the 20s that I've seen. But and these are pro-ethanol people, but I believe that that is justifiable, much as I can determine. Now, I look at the use of corn grain for ethanol as an interim process. We need to get to the cellulosic side. So the reason the Brazilian sugarcane mill is more efficient on the energy balance rise than the corn plants that we've got in this country, particularly dry milled and wet milled, are basically they haul the whole crop to the sugar mill. So they take the leaves off and everything else is taken to the plant. So they grind up the sugar cane, they leach it of its sugar, and they have all this residue left. And so the way they use the residue is they burn it. They burn it in just a plain old burner, a boiler, and that boiler produces the high pressure steam to run the generator that powers the plant, and the low pressure steam that runs the distillation units that dry the sugar or centrifuge the sugar or whatever else, or they run the fermentation side. So the low pressure steam is used. So you end up with efficiencies that are really quite different. Now,
in the nature of 1 gallon of input will equal 2 gallons of output, or
I think
put a
that
figure
the
to that?
Brazilian, I don't know the numbers, but the Brazilian one will probably be positive in the 65% range, something like this. And I don't quote me on those numbers because I'm not the person that carries those numbers around in my head. Now, if we get to the cellulosic side, we have a couple of problems. One is it's very bulky. Just like sugarcane, it's very bulky. It's not unusual to have little railroads laid out so they can load them on the little railroad cars, and it goes to the sugar mill. So you don't haul this stuff hundreds of miles. You maybe haul it 20, 25 miles, but you don't haul it hundreds of miles. So the cellulosic plant has localization problems. You have to make the plant close to where you're going to grow the materials.
Let's be a little bit more explicit in what you mean by the cellulosic.
Well, cellulosic is taking the corn stalk, the wheat straw, the hay that is high in cellulose, which you then have to, and cellulose is a very complex sugar. It's a very long chain sugar.
Or switchgrass?
Switchgrass, anything like, or wood. And you then take an enzyme which breaks this cellulose down to a sugar, a simpler sugar, which is then fermentable, and you can get your ethanol then from what we call waste material. So there's a lot of energy that's lost, out at the what we call the city dump or the landfill. Why do we continue to haul all of that high energy material and bury it, and then it gives off methanol or methane for years on end, and we're just capturing that now and people are using it. But so there's lots of things that can be done. So I think the biofuels are only beginning, and I think ethanol from corn is probably going to stay with us to some degree, but I think we're going to graduate to using what we call lower value, lower end use kinds of materials like wood, hay, corn stalks, things like this.
And many of those things you're mentioning, it would strike me, takes a lot less input in terms of the fuel that's needed.
Well, and basically, number one is you can burn it, so you don't have to power the ethanol plant with natural gas or coal. So you could provide the heat source that the present ethanol plants would need. And then you would get these ethanol plants on a par to the Brazilian plant. So that would be the simple way to do it, is just to burn it at the ethanol plant to produce the steam you need. The other thing is that you know, I mentioned to several people that we used to have something we called city gas. When I went to New Zealand in Christchurch in 1970, they were still, if you turned on your gas stove, it was powered by city gas. What they did is they burned coal incompletely with incomplete combustion, and they produced carbon monoxide and methane and the CO2 as well, and they stuck it in a line, and they called that city gas. Well, the heat value was much less than it was pure methane or pure carbon monoxide, for example, but it was adequate enough. You could boil your water, you could heat your stove, and things like this. So we have the thermochemical processes which have not been looked at very completely. At least I don't think they have. South Africa, during apartheid, essentially produced a large part of their liquid fuels from this thermochemical processes.
Basically converting coal.
Basically converting coal, but you can do it with wood, you can do it with anything that will burn. And, you know, obviously the Nazis in World War II essentially powered the German war machine by burning coal the same way to make liquid fuels. Now, how we go about all these things and how the politicians and the policymakers get this all put together remains to be seen, but we have many alternatives, as I see, besides just using corn grain for ethanol.
Another thing that has changed dramatically, I would think, in the last 20, 40, 50 years is the myriad of other ways that corn and soybeans both are now being used. Can you talk about that evolution a little bit?
Well, I'm not an expert at all in this area, but we were talking, you know, the person, his father-in-law worked for a corn products company in Chicago. And if you look at any of these integrated mills, take the ADM plant in Decatur. We use Karo syrup. You know, Karo syrup is made from corn. You can get dark or you can get white. I don't know how the difference is, but I think people would be amazed at how much corn is used for things that they have no idea there's corn there. I don't have a list of these things, but obviously we're all familiar with Fritos and Cheetos and corn curls and corn chips and corn tortillas if you're from Texas and things like this. But that's just a little bit of the wagon that is there. So I look at it this way: for a manufacturing company to invest the research that it needs to create a useful product, it has to be assured of a stable supply at a reasonable price so that they build a plant, they have a reasonable chance of making a profit for their investors. And I think that that's what's happened with corn. We've had corn at $1 and $2 for 40 years or more. Now it's up a little more expensive, but with the price of oil falling to about half of what it was earlier this summer, corn prices seem to be following along with it. We'll end up somewhere, if we want the investment community to develop alternatives, they have to have a stable supply at a reasonable price, so if they make the investment, they can probably pay back the money they borrowed, or they can pay their investors for giving their capital to invest and things like this. And I think that we have lots of opportunity in this area.
One of the things we've heard a little bit lately, and people start to realize exactly how much corn has permeated our diet. If you talk about dairy, milk or dairy foods, well, that's all based on cows processing that corn and other feeds, but primarily corn. Any kind of meat product, it comes from corn or soybeans and some grass. Corn oil is what we fry our French fries in and everything else, and you went through the whole litany of other products that obviously involve corn. You go and get that can of soda off the shelf, and that's sweetened by corn syrup. It just has an incredible penetration in terms of what we eat. And that you and I were talking yesterday about these two young college kids who on a lark decided to drive across the country and realize, man, everything we're eating is coming from corn. And then they put together this documentary called King Corn. And the message of that was, well, this isn't necessarily always a good thing that corn dominates our food chain so much. Although it's led to cheap prices, it's also led to the obesity. What's your reaction to that challenge?
Well, I think that obesity is obviously a problem for us. You know, when I was a kid, we didn't have to worry about obesity because we could probably eat 4,000 calories a day and not gain a pound because we burned it all up because we were physically involved in baling hay, milking cows, walking to school, whatever. But as we become much more what should I say, sedate in our practices, you know, things are taken care of us for us. We don't have to do all those things. And I'm not advocating everybody should do this, but it's hard to eat less when there's so much variety and it tastes as good as it does and things of this nature. So obesity is a bad problem, but it's a much better problem than famine. And so I think that I'd like to weigh about 15 pounds less than I do. I find that to be a challenge. And I don't think I'm necessarily very much out of control of where my weight should be, but if I weighed 175 pounds instead of 190 pounds, I'd probably be just as well off or better than I am now. So I think that that people who are obese, yes, that's a problem. But remember, it's a better problem than a famine. So that's number one. And the other thing is when we don't have to expend all this physical labor that we used to have to do, we have to learn to eat less, or we have to exercise more. And I find running, well, I think you'd burn your knees out on running if you aren't careful, but I find that to be a little boring. So anyway, I think a lot of other people do too.
But I'm not hearing you say that it's because corn has so dominates the nature of our diet.
I think it's corn, wheat, soybeans, the whole business. Basically, we have adequate food supply, more than enough. And I guess that I'm still a little bit perturbed when you go to a restaurant and they give you on a plate twice as much as you hoped that you got. You know, I go to some restaurants, smorgasbords, and I can say, will the percentage of obesity be higher or lower for this kind of a restaurant versus that kind of a restaurant? And you can make your own judgments, but you've done it all the same way that many of us have. And on the other hand, the variety that's available is tremendous. I mean, you go to a grocery store and the choice that people have just overwhelms you. I mean, if you, again, when I was a kid, we got 3 dips of ice cream for 10 cents. Well, you couldn't get it for $1.50 now, maybe $2. Well, that was probably more you need, but, you know, we had to go home and milk the cows, and then we had to go haul hay and haul manure and all these kind of things, so we could burn it up in a hurry. And you know, I think I told you earlier, we often had morning lunch as well as an afternoon lunch because we were physically involved in burning those calories up. Are you
proud of your involvement in American agriculture getting to the point where we have this incredible abundance that surrounds us without any tinge of guilt involved with the overproduction?
Yeah, I think what we tried to do, I think I've lived in the best of times. I think I've experienced things that as a kid which people would now say was almost subsistence living, to a point where, you know, if you want grapes from Chile, you can get them any day of the week. If you want to eat blueberries, you can get blueberries, even though they have to come from various long distances and things like that. So I think we've lived in the best of times. Now, I don't have any guilt about increasing food production. Now, how I should associate myself with obesity, oh, I guess I look at this as much more a personal choice rather than a choice that anyone makes for you.
This might be something a bit away from your area of expertise, but I'm sure you have opinions about the issue of the trend away from family farms towards corporate farms, towards agriculture as a business.
Well, I'm not sure. Economics eventually dictates. And I don't think you can rewrite the books unless you have policy people that rewrite the economic books and how they apply. I mentioned to you earlier when you had set-aside programs, you couldn't have farmer A setting aside 20% with farmer B, C, D, and E doing 100%. So the government had to put in policies so everybody had to participate in the set-aside. Else, if I got 20% less to sell because I set aside and you got your 100%, it's not a fair procedure. So I think that you end up with various kinds of political instruments that are going to have to be made to get us to where it is you want to go. Now, there are some people say that the free market can do everything, and there are others to say we got to modify it. I think that Gandhi's comment is there's plenty for everybody's human needs, but there's not enough for everybody's human greed. And I think that somewhere between need and greed, you got to have some policy. The other thing is not everybody is created as with the same level of intelligence and the same opportunity. I guess I'm glad my parents were, I was born in St. Peter, Illinois, instead of the middle of Niger, for example. And how do we then take our gift of birth to make it a fair place for the rest of the world? So I think this motivates you in various kinds of ways, but I think it motivates Dr. Borlaug and people like this. I'm concerned about people not having enough to eat. Well, if you've got enough to eat and somebody else doesn't, and that's a concern, it becomes a very big driving force. And I think that a lot of people in agriculture still have those basic kinds of feelings. So how we put it all together in the future, I'm not sure, but I think we'll get there.
Mm-hmm. So there's no nostalgia in your respect in terms of seeing the family farms kind of slip away year by year?
I don't know how to keep it from happening. I guess that, see, we started with 160 acres, of which about half of it was in red top and pasture. So we really farmed 80 acres. My brother, who still farms that land, farms about almost 1,000 acres, and he's a small farmer by today's standards. But he's got enough to own his own combine and things of this nature. But
and does he own all of that land?
No, he owns. He and I together own about half of what he farms, and then he farms the rest. He farms my uncle's land. He farms a neighbor's land, two neighbors' land. So about half of it is owned by the family, and about half of it is, either a cousin or somebody like this. And how do you recreate the 160-acre farm? I don't think you can. In other words, the only way to do it is you can't mechanize it because you can't pay for the mechanization. You have to spread that out over more. I don't think we want to go back to, the little square baler and 5 cows, 10 cows, and 30 hogs, and 300 chickens, and this kind of stuff. Now, do we want all the chickens to be in one place? Do we want all the beef cattle to be in one place? There's one thing that hasn't been able to be mechanized and scaled up as much as the feeder cattle business. We still have the mom and pops that run, 20 cows here and a couple bulls, and they sell a few calves and things like that because it requires area. So you have some of this that doesn't scale the same way as corn and bean production scales.
But this trend towards larger operations, towards much more business-oriented operations, not necessarily a bad thing?
Well, I don't see an alternative to moving in this direction. Now, whether
but I also don't hear any great regret in terms of how you're discussing.
Well, I guess I drive through small town U.S. and I'm kind of sorry to see that most of them are either antique malls or stores or storefronts are closed and things like this. So I do have some regrets in those areas, but I don't know how to play it differently, because if I'm going to open a restaurant in St. Peter, I can't count on 10,000 people going through town. There won't be that many going through town. So I've either got to figure out how many people have to eat here every day for me to succeed, and then how big an area do I have to draw that number of people from, and will they eat once a week, once a month, or how often will they eat? So I think you have to be more than nostalgic. I think you have to be what I call kind of brutally frank with what the possibilities are. And I'm not completely satisfied with all the things we've done, but economics, if you can't make a living doing what you're doing, then you're pretty much required to change your attitudes or your procedures or your investment base or some such thing to get to an acceptable standard.
Well, if I can sum it up in a different way, perhaps, and you can tell me when I'm way off base, but we're not talking about 60 bushels an acre farming anymore. We're talking about 150 to 200 bushel acres, and that requires these larger farms, but that increased production overall is a good thing.
I think so. I guess I would hate to have to shuck by hand 200 bushel corn. You would never get done. Now, my brother has a reasonable sized combine, and it takes 8 rows, going through the field. But his big problem is hauling it away from the combine. I mean, you just don't have enough wagons and trucks and things like this to keep. You can have everything emptied at night and things like this. But we're fairly fortunate that we have a large grain terminal that's less than 10 miles away. So and they can dump very fast. They got at least 3 dumps, and so generally speaking, you can put it in your own bin. And so, I think that shucking 200 bushel corn by hand would have to be a long time process.
They would say, been there, done that. You don't need to go back, huh?
No, I don't need to go back to shucking corn by hand.
What do you think, and you've talked about a lot of very significant changes that have happened in agriculture over the last 50, 60 years. What would you say is the most significant or transformative change?
Well, we've talked about hybridization and fertilization and weed control and insect control. But I think when you really get down to things that most people see is that, the total mechanization of the old processes. We don't use a scoop shovel now except to clean up the mess that you made when you didn't get the dump on the right place or some such thing as this. I mean, everything is done by a machine. The tractors are air conditioned, the combines are air conditioned, the bin handling equipment is all done by electricity or some sort of mechanized augering system or something of that nature. So one of the things, we had a fair amount of dairy cattle in the 50s, 60s. Every Saturday we had to grind feed. I never hated anything worse than grinding feed, I believe. because, you know, you had to grind whether rain or not, because Saturday you had to grind feed because the cows are going to eat on Sunday. And you didn't have enough storage capacity to not do it that way. Well, now we've, you know, a lot of times we just contract. So my brother will contract somebody to spray his crop for herbicide because the guy's got a sprayer that's 100 feet wide or 70 feet wide or whatever it is, and he's all prepared to do it, and he can get it done in, you know, hours. And maybe it's not worth me investing in a sprayer to do it myself. So we have a lot of these kinds of things which have developed because there's an economic, you know, incentive for somebody to own that equipment and, you know, let people rent it from them or do it themselves. They provide the service. So it's just put together different than it used to be. So I guess there's lots of things. But I think if you really get down to it, you know, the automobiles, we used to say they don't make automobiles as good as they used to. No, they make them better. You know, you can run a car now a couple 100,000 miles, and if you've had to overhaul the engine, you have a lemon. You know, you go back to the old 6-cylinder Chevy and the old flathead V8 Fords. If you got 60,000 miles out of those cars before you had to overhaul them, you were doing pretty well. And, you know, we used to get 25,000 miles out of a set of tires. Now, you don't get 50,000, you think there's something wrong, and you might get a lot more than that. So I think that, yes, there's a lot you could say is not like it used to be, but for the most part, I think it's much, much better. So I look at, there's sort of three legs of sustainability. One is the economic leg, another is the environmental leg, and the other is the social structure leg. And one of the things that is very strong in Africa is that social leg. They still have what we call the extended family. Grandpa and grandma get taken care of by, you know, siblings. Grandchildren get mentored by grandpa. They live. So I think that one of the things the African population and many other populations in the world do better than we do is what I call the social leg of sustainability, where, you know, when I was a kid, my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side, I never knew my grandparents on my father's side, they lived with my Uncle Art and Aunt Alma. They had their own little house, but Aunt Alma and Uncle Art were sort of their first line of you know, mentoring and making sure they were okay, and the rest of the kids came too. Well, you know, I guess one of the institutions that I find my least favorite are what I call senior homes, or places where people go to die. I think they're, you know, they're not very attractive to me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the future then. What do you see in the future of farming, especially in this region of the country, sitting on top of some of the best farmland in the world?
Well, I don't think farming is, you know, we still have to trap sunlight and take the water we get through rain and run it through a green leaf to get something for nothing. Essentially, you know, if we can produce 200 bushel corn or 150 bushel corn, it's worth $3 an acre or bushel, or $6 a bushel. But let's say it's somewhere in that category. We're producing $450 to $900 or $1,000 of something that didn't exist before. And that $900 is then distributable to people in the area in some form. Now, the landowner obviously is going to be involved, but there's going to be other supply infrastructures. But if you produce only $60, you know, you have 60 bushel corn, it's worth $1 a bushel, that's $60. Well, so I think that the future for the agricultural community is pretty substantial. I mean, we're going to have to eat. And I don't see us living off algae that grows someplace else, or we don't have enough petroleum to convert that to something we want to eat. So basically, I think that this part of the world is very fortunate to have the well-endowed soil resource, the excellent climate. You know, yeah, it's maybe not what you want every year, but for the most part it rains when it's supposed to. And you're able then to take a good set of agronomic practices and produce something that didn't exist before. And I think as long as the world's going to need something to eat, we really don't have much to worry about. The game might change the way we get there, but I think overall it's not going to change very much.
You're bullish for the future then?
Oh, no way, no other way. I mean, I think agriculture is more bullish now than it's been in a long, long time.
These really are some of the best times, economically at least, for farmers of this region.
Yeah, and you know, we got this financial meltdown at the present time, which is having some adverse effects, and we don't know where it's all going to end. But again, and agriculture is certainly adversely affected right now. So, you know, the people that make poor decisions are still going to have to pay the piper, and not everything's going to come out exactly the way you want, but that's what risk is all about. If we had everything exactly guaranteed, how boring would it be? It wouldn't be any fun at all.
Well, I suspect you have grandsons and granddaughters.
Oh yeah. I got two grandsons, and 3 granddaughters.
And maybe some nieces and nephews or grandnieces and nephews. What happens if one of those was to come up to you and say, "What do you think? I'm really thinking about going into agriculture. I'm just about ready to graduate from high school. What do you think I should do?"
Well, you know, I've got a grandson that's taking over from my brother. Or not a grandson, it'd be my nephew. Is taking over from my brother at the present time. So there's a generational shift taking place. My brother's younger than I am, but not a lot. And so this past year, he bought the combine from my brother, and he's bought a tractor, and so he's in a transition stage. I guess what I'm saying is to just start from I want to do it and not having any history of being involved is a pretty tough go. It takes a lot of money. You know, if you're going to buy land these days, I don't know what land sells for here in Springfield, but I doubt if you can buy much for $5,000 an acre.
Well, I was on a combine harvesting soybeans just south of Bloomington. The gentleman said it's about $7,500 per acre.
Yeah. Well, you know, land has always been priced so you can barely afford it. And you probably never get more than about 4 or 5% on your money under the best of conditions in terms of the particular time. And over time, you know, a land purchase 5 years ago looks better than a land purchase today, and one purchased 10 years ago looks better still. So basically, there are people that can buy pieces of land because they can spread the cost over some other land that they own and things like this, and so they're in a more favored position. So I think if the high school student wants to go into agriculture and wants to go into farming, I think he needs to have a father, an uncle, a brother, a mentor, a neighbor, or somebody that he can sort of use as a way to get started. And I think that my brother and his son, who is trying to transition from one generation to the next, he started by buying a tractor, and he bought a planter this year. He said he wanted a 16-row planter instead of an 8-row, and he ended up buying the combine. Well, he's still got a lot of things he's got to do, but he hasn't bought any land. And so the land cost, cash rents, you know, a lot of people want to cash rent. If you cash rent, you know, 3 years ago and you got a 5-year cash rent agreement, it looks pretty good in the 3rd and 4th year now. But if you got a cash rent, it's, you know, I heard somebody saying it had to pay $325 an acre for a cash rent. Well, going forward, that may not look as good unless prices recover. So farming is not for the faint-hearted, in my opinion.
Would you tell that 17-year-old, or what would you tell him about going to school?
Oh, go to school. There's no reason he should not go to school.
Are there reasons he needs to go to school?
Oh, you bet. Number one is he can learn some economics, and he'll find out that there's more than just what I think. There are actually, things that they can quantify in a process and things of this nature. But no, better decisions are made from people that are educated than from people that aren't educated. And everybody makes the best decision they know how, but if you have better background, better understanding, you can make a better decision than someone that isn't that way. And sometimes you bet on the wrong side of the wagon. Look at Bear Stearns. They're out of business because they bet the wagon on, the other side of the fence.
What's the visceral reaction that you have when you hear people who suggest that, oh, he's just a dumb farmer, or he's just an unsophisticated hick, he doesn't know what's going on?
It kind of makes me cringe. Basically, farming is a tough business. And I don't mean that in the sense that it's necessarily hard work at this point. It used to be really hard work.
Physically.
Now it's less physically hard work. But I think you have to be an economist, you have to be a futures person, you have to be an agronomist, you have to be a machinery expert, you have to be a welder. You can't run a farm and every time you got a nickel's worth of problem, you got to call somebody to fix it. You got to do it yourself, or else you lose too much time, or things of this nature. So, I think most farmers are welders, they're economists, they're agronomists. It's not that they necessarily know all that stuff, but they know enough about it to know that they need to know more, or they got to rely on somebody else to help them with that decision. And many of them, hire consultants to help them with some of these kinds of decisions. People have marketing people help them with marketing. Well, marketers in a stable environment are one thing, but marketers in an up environment, they tell you to sell before you wish you had. In a down environment, they sold too late. So all these kind of things kind of balance out over a period of time, but farmers have to know an awful lot, in my opinion. And I think they're essentially a small business where they have to make all the decisions that a small business person does. So I put the farmer and a small businessman pretty much in the same bandwagon. They handle a lot of money these days. Well,
we've covered an awful lot of bases. This has been an important discussion we've been having, and as we mentioned before, so much of it is extremely timely. But I suspect there's a couple things that you'd like to talk about a little bit more that I haven't touched base on yet.
Gosh, I'm not sure what that would be. Well, I'm just pleased. I'd say number one is I'm pleased that you persisted in getting me here. The first time I said, well, why me? And then, I said, well, the last time I responded, I said, well, I'll go through Springfield and see who those guys are. And anyway, I'm glad I did. So I look forward. Illinois is still home for me. I don't think it'll ever change. Now, for my kids, it's not home anymore. It's either Texas or Missouri. My son's Texas and my daughter's Missouri. That's where they went to high school. So basically, I think Illinois sits in a very favored position. The Midwest, the Corn Belt, sits in a very favored position. Yes, there will be bumps along the road, no question about it. But, more people die of boredom than anything I know of, but I don't think most farmers that are active farmers are very bored for very long. So.
Well, Ed, you've had a very full and productive life. you've been all over the world and back a few times. What do you look back at and say I'm proudest about in terms of your accomplishments?
Oh, I've never really dwelled on that very much. I think I've been lucky. Now, luck is having a plan that somebody thinks is, had a lot of prior thought. But I think you can plan your own luck to some degree. I could have easily not gone to New Zealand because the kids were in school and, it cost a lot of money and things like this. But, gee, the world would be different if I hadn't done that. I could have stayed in Illinois and not gone to Missouri or not gone to Texas. And the world would be different. And I'm not sure it would be any worse or maybe any better. But you have to say when I used to teach, I used to tell kids that if you say no to every time you get asked to do something, before long nobody's going to ask you to do anything. Now, if you say yes, and you found out that when you went through that door on the other side was, gosh, why did I do this? You've already learned something. And secondly, you learned that you maybe won't do that again. But I think the thing that you got to do is continually try and find out a new opportunity. You got to say yes. You got to be an optimist. I mean, pessimists are no fun. And now you got to have optimism founded in some kind of an educational framework. But I think you can put a lot of these kind of things together. And I guess if you look at education, I was the first in my family to go to college. Well, where would I be if I hadn't gone to college? Uncle Sam wanted me to farm his farm. I think he'd have given it to me. Well, life would have been very different. And maybe I'd been just as happy as I am now. But anyway, I think you make your luck.
And it strikes me you are very happy with the life you've led.
Well, most days.
Well, you've got a lot to be proud of.
Well,
this has been a wonderful interview. It's been very educational and informative for me, and I certainly think it will be for anybody who takes the time and the effort to listen to it as well. So thank you very much, Ed, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mark, for the opportunity.
Okay.